Never ignore a child's cry for help. You might think it's just a tantrum or a bad day, but sometimes, those cries hide something much darker. This isn't just any story, it's about a little girl named Amina. She lived in a small village nestled between rolling hills and lush greenery. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where neighbors were like family, and life moved at a slower pace. But beneath the surface of this peaceful village, something sinister was brewing. Amina was a bright, curious child, full of energy and laughter. She loved playing with her friends, chasing after butterflies, and listening to her grandmother's tales by the fire. Her parents worked hard to provide for her, but there was always something missing in Amina's life, a sense of safety. No one could have guessed what was happening behind closed doors. The village itself was a patchwork of mud huts and small houses, some with tin roofs that glinted under the sun. The air smelled of earth after rain, mixed with the scent of cooking fires and fresh herbs from the gardens. Children ran barefoot along narrow paths, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the rhythm of life followed the seasons. But for Amina, this idyllic setting hid a dark truth. Every day, as she walked home from school, she felt a growing sense of dread. The path that once brought her joy now filled her with fear. She would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone following her. Her heart raced as she hurried past familiar faces, wondering if anyone could see the terror hiding behind her smile. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Amina sat quietly at the dinner table. Her father was away on business, and her mother had been unusually quiet all day. The house felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. That night, Amina couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't fully understand. She had seen things, heard things, that made her stomach churn. Her uncle, who often came to visit, had started acting strange around her. He would linger in her room longer than necessary, his hands brushing against her skin in ways that made her feel uncomfortable. She didn't know why, but she knew it wasn't right. The next morning, Amina tried to tell her mother about what had happened. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Mommy, Uncle John, he..." But before she could finish, her mother shushed her, telling her not to make up stories. "Uncle John loves us," she said, "his family." Amina felt a knot form in her stomach. She wanted to believe her mother, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. She tried again, this time during lunch, when her mother seemed more relaxed. "Mommy, I don't like Uncle John touching me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But her mother only sighed, patting her on the head. "It's nothing, sweetheart, just your imagination." As the days passed, Amina grew more and more withdrawn. She stopped playing with her friends, stopped laughing at jokes, and stopped asking questions. She began to wonder if anyone would ever believe her. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was wrong. But every time Uncle John came over, she felt that same sickening feeling in her gut, the same sense of dread that made her want to run and hide. Her room, once a sanctuary filled with toys and books, became a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every touch, every word, every moment of fear. She wished she could scream, but no sound came out. She wished she could run, but her legs felt heavy, weighed down by the burden of silence. One afternoon, while Amina was sitting alone in her room, she heard a knock at the door. It was her teacher, Mrs. Kofi. Mrs. Kofi was a kind woman, with a warm smile and gentle eyes. She had always been Amina's favorite teacher, the one person Amina trusted completely. When Mrs. Kofi saw Amina's pale face and tear-streaked cheeks, she knew something was wrong. "Are you okay, Amina?" Mrs. Kofi asked, kneeling down beside her. Amina hesitated, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to get into trouble, didn't want to cause problems. But something inside her snapped, and before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out. "Uncle John touches me," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't like it." Mrs. Kofi's face softened, and she gently took Amina's hand. "Tell me everything," she said softly. And so, Amina did. She told Mrs. Kofi about the times Uncle John had come into her room late at night, about the way he would touch her in places that made her feel that. She told her about how her mother wouldn't listen, how she felt so alone. When Amina finished, Mrs. Kofi stood up, her face set in determination. "We need to tell someone," she said. "This isn't okay, Amina." You deserve to be safe. But even as Mrs. Kofi spoke, Amina felt a flicker of doubt. What if no one believed her? What if they thought she was lying? She had already tried telling her mother, and look how that had turned out. But Mrs. Kofi's words gave her hope, a tiny spark of light in the darkness that had consumed her for so long. Together, they went to the principal's office, where they explained everything to him. The principal listened carefully, his expression grave. He promised to take action to make sure Amina was protected. But as they left the office, Amina couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at her insides. What if Uncle John found out? What if he hurt her, or worse, her family? Over the next few days, Amina watched nervously as the adults in her life began to investigate. Social workers visited the house, asking questions and taking notes. Police officers came and went, their faces stern and serious. Amina's mother was questioned, her uncle was interrogated, and the whole village seemed to be buzzing with rumors and whispers. For Amina, it was both a relief and a burden. On one hand, she was glad that someone was finally listening to her, that people were taking her seriously. But on the other hand, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Every time she saw her uncle, she felt a wave of fear wash over her, wondering if he would try to hurt her or her family. She wished she could go back to the way things were before, when life was simple and carefree. But deep down, Amina knew that wasn't possible. Once you've seen the truth, once you faced the darkness, there's no going back. And as much as she wanted to forget, to pretend it never happened, she knew she couldn't. She had to be brave, had to stand up for herself and for others like her. The day of the trial arrived, and Amina found herself standing in a courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been in a place like this before, with its cold, sterile atmosphere and the weighty silence that hung in the air. Her uncle sat across from her, his face blank and emotionless, as if he didn't care what happened to him. Amina's mother was there too, sitting in the front row, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked at Amina with a mixture of guilt and sorrow, as if she was finally realizing the gravity of what had happened. But Amina couldn't focus on her mother right now. All she could think about was the man sitting across from her, the man who had hurt her, who had made her feel so small and powerless. When it was her turn to testify, Amina stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She walked slowly to the witness stand, her heart racing faster with every step. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, watching, waiting, judging. But she took a deep breath and reminded herself of why she was here, to tell the truth, to make sure no one else had to suffer like she did. As she began to speak, her voice shaky at first, Amina felt a surge of strength flow through her. She told the judge and jury everything, leaving out no detail, no matter how painful. She described the way her uncle had touched her, the way he had made her feel, the way her mother had ignored her pleas for help. And as she spoke, she could see the expressions on the faces of the people in the room change, from disbelief to horror, from indifference to outrage. When she finished, there was a long, tense silence. Then, the judge spoke. "Thank you, Amina," he said quietly. "You've been very brave." And in that moment, Amina felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had done it. She had told her story, had faced her fears, and had fought for justice. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. In the end, Amina's uncle was found guilty and sentenced to prison. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a start. Amina's mother, though still struggling to come to terms with what had happened, began to seek help, to learn how to be a better parent, a better protector. And Amina, though scarred by her experiences, began to heal, to find joy in the little things again. Her story is a reminder to all of us, parents, teachers, neighbors, friends, that we must listen to children, must take their concerns seriously. We must recognize the signs of abuse and act quickly to ensure their safety. Because sometimes, a child's cry for help is the only warning we'll get.